Hello, and welcome to my stream. It's been a little while since I've done this. It's looking like the issues I was having before are fine now. Let me test my audio real quick. Sounds fine to me. Let's get some of this going. Oops, daisy. So, how do I put this? I have been taking a short break because I had some issues with the stream about a month ago, and I just didn't feel like coming back for a while. But I'm glad I'm back now. Actually, let me try one more thing. Okay, I can decrease this a little bit. Increase that just a little bit. Sorry, just give me one. I have no idea how to test audio and stuff before I go live, so I have to do it on the fly. No, still very loud. How about if I do that? How about if I just go all the way with it, you know? How about, I test it again. Still loud. I'm gonna do this. I'm just gonna do this. Let's decrease it from the source instead of on my computer. That might help a lot. Again, this is the first couple minutes. It's fine. I can run some tests on audio. Okay, this should be fine, right? Right, guys, this should be good. Okay, so the plan for this stream this week is to read some short stories that I really enjoy. I have a few on the docket here from separate collections. So I'm gonna try to read at least 3. That's my plan. 3 separate stories. If I really enjoy this experience, I'll add on 1 or 2 more. But for now, I have 3 sort of loaded up. It also depends on how long it goes. If I think it's whatever, and it's only like an hour long, I'll add on the 4th story. I mean, I doubt it'll only be an hour long with 3 stories, but it's something. If I feel like it's not going long enough, and I kind of want to extend it, and I'm not super loving it, I'll do at least 1 more. But if it's going like 2 hours, for example, after I finish 3, and I'm loving it to death, I'll still throw in a couple more because I'm enjoying myself. You know what I mean? But I do want to stream for a little bit. I do want to stream for a little bit today just to get back into the swing of things. Because what happened last time was that was upsetting, deep down in my soul, and I don't like that. So let's say we get started. One more time, I'm gonna check the audio. Okay, I can increase it. I can increase just a little bit, just this much more, just this much more. Okay, so going to start off with a short story from Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. This specific short story is called In the Court of the Dragon. Now, The King in Yellow is very notably referenced in the hit television program True Detective, the first season specifically. With, the main antagonist of that season being the Yellow King. It's a very direct reference. And it's no coincidence that in a sort of cosmic horror themed season of that show, they pulled from a cosmic horror themed story, or series of stories rather. What I find interesting about this short story collection is that it's called The King in Yellow, And The King in Yellow is technically this fictional play that, in the universe of this collection, if you read it, you start going insane. Now, why would anyone read it knowing that? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But people do read it, and they go bonkers. Uh, a thing about this short story collection I don't like is about halfway through, it transitions from that theme of cosmic horror and reading plays that make you go crazy into just weird slice of life stories of people in Paris, and it's not good. Like those are really boring and uninteresting, and apparently they're like a continuation of a series of short stories that Chambers wrote previously. And I'm like, why put it in this collection? It doesn't matter. I guess I just want more of what the beginning half of this is, or even if he just ended it when those stories ended, I think it would have been a solid short collection of stories. But whatever. This one in particular stands out to me for a number of reasons, but the main one being it's just damn good. I think the writing is fantastic. There's a feeling of hopelessness and dread that I feel really just to exemplify what kind of horror he was going for. And I love some of the imagery that is evoked towards the ending of the short story. This one is, I think, the shortest out of all the ones I'm going to read. I think this one or the third one. I don't really know. I actually don't know. I might speak too soon. But yeah, let's get started. I think everyone who's here is going to be here. So let's get into it. In the Court of the Dragon. And I should also mention that at the start of every short story, there's a small excerpt from the fake play that that is read, or that is written there. So I'll read it out. No, don't go crazy on me. O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn, in hell whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying, mercy on them, God, why who art thou to teach and he to learn? What does that mean? I don't know. Alright, let's begin with the story proper. In the Court of the Dragon. In the Church of St. Barnaby, or actually, one more pause, I should also say that this takes place in France. Even though Chambers was an American author, he had this fascination with France. I mean, he must have lived there or some bullshit like that. But yeah, so there's going to be a lot of words that are French that I'm sure I'll not pronunciate correct. Did I even pronunciate correctly? I don't know. It's not for me to say. So yes, just so you know, if you hear a word that doesn't seem English, that is why. In the church of St. Barnaby, vespers were over. The clergy left the altar, the little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled in the stalls. A Suis in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every fourth step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsieur C. Now, another quick pause. I guess this is a little annotation. For some reason or another, Monsieur C is what's written, but C has like a dash next to it, like inferring that this must have been a real person that the author censored the name of for whatever reason. I don't know. So I'll just be referring to them as Monsieur C whenever they're mentioned. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned towards the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ voluntarily ceased. I had always found the organ playing at St. Barnaby highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid if cold intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified, and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord I had felt a change for the worse, a sinister change. During Vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir. But now and again, quite wantonly as it seemed, from the west gallery, where the great organ stands, a heavy hand struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at St. Barnaby, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. I had read of such things happening too, but not in the works on architecture. Then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the sorry. Uh, Then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century Rococo. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords, fit to accompany meditation, while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation, who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, with the manual's blared approval. Poor devil! Whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of kneeling nuns still turned toward the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadows of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monsieur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now at last the preacher had made the sign of the cross, and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausting body, and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favorite church for healing. For I had been... let me pause for a second and get to the dancing. Thank you, Leo. Read a long story, just kidding, keep it up, bud. Leo, you scared me. I was like, I gotta read a long story now. Then I saw you're just kidding, and now I understand that it was a joke. Thank you so much for the sub. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the stories. I guess just to catch you up for the page and a half I've read so far, this dude is in a church, and someone is playing the organ very abrasively and loudly and annoyingly, but no one else but him seems to notice. Okay. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausting body, and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favorite church for healing, for I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together and lay down in their dens. Monsieur C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes, and passing along the gallery on his way out. I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs, which descends directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. Excuse me. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here at last was the ease of mind I longed for. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Father's. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on, in his coolest, clearest tones, because... But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ, and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, as if he had returned, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank, and yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes, a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before? For the moment, all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief. And for that moment I never doubted, but in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even colored glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that, when I was turned towards it, whatever moved at the west end could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed, it was no wonder that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was likely a place to harbor supernatural horror. This was a likely place to harbor supernatural horrors. Excuse me. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monsieur C. His collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. That flyaway lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her golden trumpet at him, and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which, at the time, I thought very amusing, and sat and chaffed myself and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monsieur C. himself, for all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it for the jingle in my ears of, "The skirts of St. Paul has reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached," keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining at the Rue Saint Honoré as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquille, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths, and a golden cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away... sorry. Got distracted. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he'd threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had laid dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best I could to the Rue de Rivoli across the Place de la Concorde, and I was on the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods on the faraway arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of gray stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again, coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cour de la Reine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across the Champs-Élysées, and turned toward the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow, he sat on the bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face, but he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate, and still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it, and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside his loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing, the will and the power to work me evil. In anguish, I watched him leave. Oh my God, forgive me. In anguish, I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Grand Républicain. He was soon lost to sight, and I turned and fled into the Bois, and far out beyond it, I know not where it went. But after a long while, as it seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at a table before a small cafe. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was so tired, so tired! It longed to hide away. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue de Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue de Rennes is a balcony supported by an iron dragon, with the court within the court, tall old houses rise on either side and close the ends that give on to the two streets. Huge gates, swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways, close this court. After midnight, one must enter then by ringing on certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects unsavory pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open on the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by iron workers. All day long, the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavory as it is below, there is cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up the Altiers, I actually don't know how to pronounce Atelier's. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fete markets. Excuse me. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and our refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them, with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out in the street. The place was quite deserted. lighted by a few lanterns hung high up, in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of the house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street. With only a bit of passageway intervening, I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him, 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they now met again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backwards down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue du Dragon. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring into the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue du Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly near. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which had threatened had arrived. This thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Swiss staff in the south aisle preceding Monsieur C. to the scarcity. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbor, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin, bent arm in its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had sought it. I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it, for I knew him now. Death and the awful abode of lost souls withered my weakness long ago and sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he had come to do, and now I knew, while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. Dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away. The arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose beyond the moon. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, and changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in the waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God." And that was Robert W. Chambers's In the Court of the Dragon. I love that story. Very, very good. I like the sort of fake, very short, but sort of fake out twist where, oh, he was just dreaming the whole time. Just kidding. But no, it turns out he wasn't dreaming. He's dead now. That is a heavy inspiration for a lot of cosmic horror stuff to follow it. In and of itself, I think True Detective Season 1 took from that story specifically, honestly. Not just from the King in Yellow's collection as a whole, but that story specifically. With the Black Stars, the Carcosa, which, I mean, Carcosa is a reference to Ambrose Bierce is an inhabitant of Carcosa, but I do think that they took Carcosa from the King in Yellow, and not from the original Carcosa that Ambrose Bierce wrote. Speaking of Ambrose Bierce, we'll be reading him soon enough. So yes, that is the first story. Hope you enjoyed it. I stumbled my way through that one. I mumbled and stumbled and fumbled my way. Hopefully I'll do better in the next story. It's the first time doing this. I very rarely read out loud, so that was a bit of a weird experience. Hopefully I do better in the stories coming up. And speaking of the stories coming up, if no one has any questions or any comments or anything at all, we'll move right on. This is The Nighthawk Star by Kenji Miyazawa. Not a horror story. This is more of a... I don't even know how to put this. More of a fanciful story. You did great. Thank you, Leo. Appreciate it. I hope that the story itself is written to be sort of confusing and weird, and for you to not really know what's happening at any moment. So I hope that came across and it didn't just sound like me not making sense. Jake Twitchin, what's up? I haven't read out loud in probably a decade. That was a good time. Thank you very much. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of what I have today. The Nighthawk Star is again, what's the word? Like it's not a children's story, but it's more in the theme of, I guess, like a folk tale than anything else. It's not a folk tale because it's more recently written. I think in like the early 19th or the early 20th century, like 1910 or some shit like that, is when this was written. Around then. I could be wrong. Could have been a bit later. But I think it was around then. And it's a beautiful story. And the collection it's a part of, Night on the Galactic Railroad. The titular Night on the Galactic Railroad is an even better story. I am in love with it. It is incredible, but it is much longer than the other stuff I'm going to read tonight. If I end up doing this again, and I want to do longer stories, I might just dedicate a stream to reading Night on the Galactic Railroad, because it is, in my mind, a masterpiece of a short story. But for now, we'll be reading The Nighthawk Star, which is almost as incredible and beautifully written. And I say, let's get to it, you know? No more faffing around. Actually, you know what? I will faff around for a bit longer. I do want to get myself some water. So please enjoy the dulcet tones of my voice while I get a glass of sweet, sweet water for myself. You'll hope you hear it being poured into the mic there. Hope you're enjoying the nice ambient music I've chosen for this stream. Didn't want to do anything that overpowered the words too much. Alright, let's begin. The Nighthawk Star by Kenji Miyazawa. The Nighthawk was truly an ugly bird. His face looked as if it had been spattered with brown miso paste. His broad beak extended nearly ear to ear, and his short, wobbly legs inhibited him from walking more than a few feet. And so it was because of these physical peculiarities that the other birds hated looking at him. Take the lark. While by no means an especially attractive bird, he even regarded himself high above the nighthawk. Should their paths have happened to cross at twilight, the lark would, with an off-putting expression, pretend he hadn't seen the other bird, shutting his eyes tightly and turning his head firmly in the other direction until the nighthawk had passed. And smaller birds were always bad-mouthing the nighthawk behind his back, saying, "Humph, he's come out again. Just look at that sorry face. It pains me to count him among us birds. Tell me about it. With a mouth as big, you'd think he was one of those frogs." As well as other nasty things. Oh, if only he were the real hawk. Then the mere mention of his name would send those shallow little birds shrinking into the leaves to hide. But in spite of his name, the nighthawk bore no relation to the hawk. He was, in fact, the elder brother of both the beautiful kingfisher and the hummingbird, who was considered the jewel in the bird's family crown. For dinner, the kingfisher fished and the hummingbird feasted on honey, but the nighthawk caught and ate the little bugs. Since he had neither strong claws nor a sharp beak, even the weakest of birds had little to fear from him. How strange it was, then, to have hawk in his name! Then they only resembled one another in two ways, the first being that the nighthawk's wings were quite strong. When he flew, they looked like blades slicing through the wind, and were easy to mistake for the hawk's. The second was that his cry was very piercing and too much like the hawk's. Naturally, this did not sit well with the real hawk, who angrily demanded the Nighthawk do something about his name every time he saw him. So it happened one evening, after a long series of threats, that the hawk paid a formal visit to the Nighthawk's nest. "Hey, you home?" The hawk called out. "I see you've yet to change your name. You're unexpectedly brazen for such a lesser bird. But I'll have you listen here, now. You and I couldn't be more different. I can soar anywhere I please within the great blue sky, while you can only come out at dusk, or at best when it's overcast. And just look at my fine beak and claws. I'm sure you'll find yours cannot compare." "But, Mr. Hawk," the Nighthawk replied, "how can I change my name? It's not as if I named myself. My name was given to me, by God." "I beg to differ," retorted the hawk. "That could certainly be said of my name, that it was given to me by God, but you've only borrowed yours, half from me and half from the night. Now I ask that you return both those names to their rightful owners." "But Mr. Hawk," the Nighthawk cried, "that just isn't possible." "Oh yes it is. I'll give you a new name. We'll call you Pipsqueak, a fitting name for you. Now when one changes one's name, it's imperative he make it his own. So, pay attention now," the hawk continued. "You are to tie a sign around your neck with Pipsqueak written on it. Then you'll go into the forest and visit each nest to announce that from this time forward, you are to be addressed solely by that name and not as the Nighthawk any longer." "I can't do that," the Nighthawk protested. "You can and you will," the hawk insisted. "If I hear you haven't done so by tomorrow morning, I'll come at you at once to fell you. I'll catch you in my claws and kill you, make no mistake. Early next morning, I'll fly myself to each bird's nest's home and ask if you visited. And if I find you've missed even one, then that will be the end of you." "But that's impossible," cried the Nighthawk again. "If you're going to make me do such a thing, then I'd rather just die now. Please, strike me down here and now." "Calm down now, and think it over. Pipsqueak isn't such a bad name." Having stated his business, the hawk unfurled his giant wings and departed, leaving the Nighthawk to ponder his situation. "What is it about me that makes the others hate me so? I suppose it's because my face looks as if it's been smeared with miso paste, and my mouth is very wide. But even so, it's not as if I've ever done anything bad. Why, when the white-eyed chick fell from her nest, I caught him and brought him home. But when I did, the white-eye snatched him back as if she thought I'd tried to steal him. Then she laughed at me, didn't she? And so scornfully, too. And now, to be forced to change my own name, to wear a different one about my neck, it's too much to handle." By now it was growing dark, so the Nighthawk took from his nest. The setting sun tinged the mountaintops red, and the clouds hung gray. And lo, seeming to bear down upon the earth, as if skimming through them, the Nighthawk soared soundlessly through the sky. Then, quite suddenly, he opened his large mouth as wide as it would go, and, with both wings spread, shot downward like an arrow, catching insects in his mouth one after another. Just before his body hit the ground, he nimbly swerved back into the air. When the Nighthawk flew with all his strength in this way, the sky appeared as if it were being split asunder. He caught a large beetle next. I lost it. He caught a large beetle next, which struggled as it made its way down his throat. He managed to swallow it, but for some reason, a cold chill ran down his back once he had. The sky had now gone pitch black, and only the mountaintops farthest to the west still caught the light of the sun, burning ominously. With the feeling of a weight pressing down on his chest, the Nighthawk rose upward. He caught another beetle in his mouth, but it too, beat terribly against the sides of his throat as he swallowed it. When he did manage to get it down, his heart took an awful leap. Letting out a sorrowful trill, the Nighthawk began to weep. He circled over and over in the sky, crying all the while. "Ha! Every night I kill so many insects, and now I am to be killed by the hawk. Oh, why is it all so trying? So sad. So sad. I'll stop eating bugs. Let me die of starvation instead. But no, the hawk will have already slain me. Let me go flying then, to somewhere far beyond the expanses of the sky." The Nighthawk went to see his younger brother, the Kingfisher. The pretty bird was still awake and gazing at the distant mountains when he spotted his elder brother descending. "Hello, brother. You look harried. Do you have some urgent news?" "No, well, that is," the Nighthawk stammered. "You see, it's just that I must go somewhere far away, and before I do, I wanted to see you." "Brother?" the Kingfisher cried out, alarmed. "Don't go. The hummingbird lives so far away. Without you, it will be as if I'm all alone." "Well, That can't be helped. Oh, please, the Nighthawk begged. Say no more, and promise me that from now on you'll only catch fish when you're hungry. Don't go doing it just for sport. Farewell. Brother, tell me what's happened. Come now, stay and talk this over with me. No, nothing can change my fate. Look after the hummingbird for me, and farewell. We'll never meet again. Farewell. With tears running down his little face, the Nighthawk rushed back to his nest. By now, the short summer night was already drawing to an end. The leaves of the ferns, blue and cold, shivered as they breathed in the morning mist. The Nighthawk tidied up his belongings and neatly groomed his feathers before leaving his home, and for the final time with a high-pitched cry. As the sun rose to the east, the mist cleared. I'm sorry, I read that very strangely. As the sun rose to the east, the mist cleared. Even though the brilliance of the light made him dizzy, the Nighthawk persevered as he threw himself oh my god. Nighthawk persevered as he threw himself like a javelin straight at the sun. "Oh sun, great sun up above," he cried out, "please take me up to where you are. I don't care should I burn to ashes. Even my ugly body would emit some small sparkle as it burned away. Please, bring me up to where you are." But no matter how he flew, the sun never grew any nearer. On the contrary, it moved farther and farther away, and as it did, it said, "You are the Nighthawk, are you not? It must be difficult for you, flying in my light. Try traversing the night sky instead and ask the stars for their help, for you are a nocturnal bird." The Nighthawk attempted a bow to show his appreciation for the sun's advice, but by now he was so exhausted that he merely dipped downward, falling into the grassy field below. There he fell into a slumber and dreamt. He saw himself rising infinitely upward among the gaps in the stars, and then he felt himself being blown eternally forward by a freezing wind. Finally, he dreamt that the hawk had found him and was clutching his body in his fearsome claws. The Nighthawk awoke with a start when something cold unexpectedly hit his face. It was a drop of dew off the pampas grass in which he lay. While he slept, the sky turned to dusk, and the stars above had begun to glimmer. The Nighthawk steeled his resolve and, gathering all his strength, took to the sky again. "O star up on high, eastern star burning white," the Nighthawk called out, "please take me up to where you are. I don't care should I burn to ashes." But the star, Orion, paid him little mind and continued singing his heroic song. Feeling greatly discouraged, his body all a-quiver, the Nighthawk almost lost the strength to stay afloat, but instead he turned and looked for help elsewhere in the vast night sky. Next he headed south, towards Canis Major. "O star up on high, southern star, shining bright," the Nighthawk called out, "please, take me up to where you are. I don't care should I burn to ashes." But Canis Major, shining stunningly in purple and yellow hues, merely replied, "What foolish words do leave your mouth? What are you, some bird? A hawk? Your wings couldn't bring you to me even if you flew for 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000, quintillion years." He then settled his gaze elsewhere. Really depressed by this response, the Nighthawk almost lost his strength again, but was able to muster up his resolve, talking to the north straight towards Ursa Major. "O star, up on high, great northern star, please take me up to where you are," the Nighthawk called out, but to his plea Ursa Major answered quietly, "What foolish thoughts are in your head? Go cool it a while instead. Try diving into an ocean full of icebergs, although in your case, a cup of ice water will serve just as well." Defeated yet again, the Nighthawk gathered his waning energy to continue his flight. He turned west and headed to the other side of the Milky Way, which had just become visible. There he called out to the constellation Achaea, "O star up on high, great western star, please take me up to where you are. I don't care if I should burn to ashes." With a pompous air, Achaea responded, "That is an impossible request. Becoming a star requires a certain grace, a sense of bearing, an essence of character that you decidedly lack. Coming from money doesn't hurt either." By now, the Nighthawk was all but completely exhausted. Closing his wings, he let himself plummet downward, but just before his weak little legs smashed down upon the ground, the Nighthawk suddenly shot up like a flare. He ascended until he reached the sky's midpoint, where his body jolted as if hit by lightning, feathers standing all on end. At that moment, he looked just as a hawk does when attacking a bear. He let out a piercing screech. "Go! Go! Go!" I'm not just saying that, it says it in the book. It says it in the book right there. Right there, it says it. And his voice, too, was like a hawk's. The birds sleeping in the forest the The birds sleeping in the forest and fields below all awoke at the sound and, trembling fearfully, gazed up at the starry sky where the Nighthawk continued his climb, higher and higher. The light of the sun tinging the mountaintops looked like little more than the end of a burning cigarette to him now. Soon the air around him was cold enough to turn his breath white and freeze his wings, which he could flap less freely as the atmosphere grew thinner. Yet the stars above seemed no closer than before. The Nighthawk's breathing turned ragged, and he felt as if his body were being pumped like a bellows. The bitter chill and frost tore through him like a jagged knife, and when his wings had gone almost entirely numb, he opened his tear-filled eyes to behold the sky one last time. Yes, these were the Nighthawk's final moments. He could no longer discern whether he was falling or rising, having lost all sense of up and down. He did know that his heart had grown very calm, and to look at him flipped upside down, his wide mouth now coated in blood, one would see he was smiling. After another moment, the Nighthawk opened his eyes clear and wide, his body transforming into a beautiful blue light, a phosphorus flame. Close beside him lay Cassiopeia, and clear behind him shone the pale light of the Milky Way. Between the two, the Nighthawk star began to burn silently, and so it would continue to burn indefinitely. Even today, it is still ablaze. And that was Kenji Miyazawa with the Nighthawk Star. Hope you enjoyed that one. Again, someday I plan on reading Galactic Railroad. I think that'd be fun. That is a beautiful story, but that's a nice little short taste of Kenji Miyazawa. Now, did you guys enjoy that one? Very different from the last story. Not so much a horror as a it's kind of a bummer, honestly, how much they own that bird. That bird gets dunked on constantly. Poor little guy. I like that story a lot. I love spatial cosmic imagery a lot, and that has that. I love the ending where he just nestled between a galaxy and a star and becomes his own star. It's very nice. It's very nice. Okay, coming up next is Ambrose Bierce from one of his many collections of short stories. This one is called... where the fuck is it? This one is called An Occurrence at Brownville. And I ain't talking about no toilet. That's what I'm saying. I ain't talking about no stinky toilet. This is, again... I wouldn't call this horror. More suspense, more of a mystery, with sort of horror elements to it. Thriller elements more, I guess. So there's an annotation at the bottom of this that reads, "This story was written in collaboration with Miss Ina Lillian Peterson, to whom is rightly due the credit for whatever merit it may have." So I guess technically this, even though Ambrose Bierce it has this in his short story collection, he credits this with Ina Lillian Peterson, who I looked up and couldn't find anything about. I think this was the only thing she wrote. I think they were just friends, and she wasn't an author, and they co-wrote this, and he was giving her credit. From what I can tell, from what I've read of Ambrose Bierce, he was a pretty cool guy, especially for the time he lived in. I feel like he was as good of a person as you could have been back then. So I respect that. He also was a forefather of cosmic horror and that sort of storytelling. His stories weren't necessarily cosmic horror, but he definitely paved the way for stories to have those sorts of elements in them. And I love that. I respect that a lot. And with this story, it's that it doesn't really have those elements so much, but I still think it's a good story. And this one is... I think this one may be the longest, by not that much. I think it's about just a little bit longer than the first story I read. And judging by the time, I would be surprised if I finished this story in over an hour or something, so I will be probably reading another story or two after this as well. So, that said, let's get started. An Occurrence at Brownville by Ambrose Bierce and Ina Lillian Peterson. Actually, before I start, let me take a sip of nice water. I taught a little country school near Brownville, which, as everyone knows who has had the good luck to live there, is the capital of a considerable expanse of the finest scenery in California. The town is somewhat frequented in summer by a class of persons whom it is the habit of the local journal to call pleasure seekers, but who by adjuster classification will be known as the sick and those in adversity. Brownville itself might rightly enough be described, indeed, as a summer place of last resort. It is fairly well endowed with boarding houses, at the least pernicious of which I performed twice a day, lunching at the schoolhouse, the humble rite of cementing the alliance between soul and body. From this hostelry, as the local journal preferred to call it when it did not call it a caravanserai, I don't know what that word means, to the local schoolhouse, the distance by wagon road was about a mile and a half. But there was a trail, very little used, which led over an intervening range of low, heavily wooded hills, considerably shortening the distance. By this trail, I was returning one evening later than usual. It was the last day of the term, and I had been detained at the schoolhouse until almost after dark, preparing an account of my stewardship for the trustees, two of whom, I proudly reflected, would be able to read it, and the third, an instance of the dominion of mind over matter, would be overruled in his customary antagonism to the schoolmaster of his own creation. I had gone not more than a quarter of the way when finding interest in the antics of a family of lizards which dwelt thereabout, and seemed full of reptilian joy for their immunity from the ills. My God, I lost my way in the middle of a sentence. Which dwelt thereabout and seemed full of reptilian joy for their immunity from the ills incident to life at the Brownville house. I sat upon a fallen tree to observe them. As I leaned wearily against a branch of the gnarled old trunk, the twilight deepened in the somber woods, and the faint new moon began casting visible shadows and gilding the leaves of the trees with a tender but ghostly light. Suddenly, I heard the sound of voices, a woman's angry, impetuous rising against deep masculine tones, rich and musical. I strained my eyes, peering through the dusky shadows of the wood, hoping to get a view of the intruders on my solitude, but could see no one. For some yards in each direction, I had an uninterrupted view of the trail, and knowing no other within a half-mile, thought the persons heard must be approaching from the wood at one side. There was no sound but that of the voices, which were now so distinct that I could catch the words. One was that of a man, evidently the tone, though deep and low, giving me an impression of anger, abundantly confirmed by the matter spoken. "I will have no threats. You are powerless, as you very well know. Let things remain as they are, or by God, you shall both suffer for it." "What do you mean?" This was the voice of a woman, a cultivated voice, the voice of a lady. "You would not murder us?" There was no reply, at least none that was audible to me. During the silence, I peered into the woods in hopes to get a glimpse of the speakers, for I had felt sure that this was an affair of gravity, in which ordinary scruples ought not to count. It seemed to me that the woman was in peril. At any rate, the man had not disavowed a willingness to murder. When a man is enacting the role of potential assassin, he has not the right to choose his audience. After some time, I saw them, indistinct in the moonlight, among the trees. The man, tall and slender, appeared clothed in black. The woman wore, as nearly as I could make out, a gown of clinging gray stuff. Evidently, they were still unaware of my presence in the shadow. For some reason, they renewed their conversation. They spoke in lower tones, and I could no longer understand. As I looked, the woman seemed to sink to the ground and raise her hands in supplication, as is frequently done on the stage and never, so far as I know, anywhere else. And I am not altogether sure that it was done in this instance. The man fixed his eyes upon her. They seemed to glitter bleakly in the moonlight with an expression that made me apprehensive that he would turn them upon me. I do not know by what impulse I was moved, but I sprang to my feet of the shadow. At that instant, the figures vanished. I peered in vain through the spaces among the trees and clumps of undergrowth. The night wind rustled the leaves. The lizards had retired early, reptiles of exemplary habits. The little moon was already slipping behind a black hill in the west. I went home somewhat disturbed in mind, half doubting that I had heard or seen any living thing excepting the lizards. It all seemed a trifle odd and uncanny. It was as if among the various phenomena, objective and subjective, that I made the sum of total of the incident there had been an uncertain element which had diffused its dubious character over all, had leavened the whole mass with unreality. I did not like it. At the breakfast table the next morning there was a new face. Opposite me sat a young girl at whom I glanced carelessly as I took my seat. In speaking to the high and mighty female personage who condescended to seem to wait upon us, I read that very weird. Let me try that one more time. In speaking to the high and mighty female personage who condescended to seem to wait upon us, this girl soon invited my attention by the sound of her voice, which was like, yet not altogether like, the one still murmuring in my memory of the previous evening's adventure. A moment later, another girl, a few years older, entered the room and sat at the left of the other, speaking to her in a gentle good morning. By her voice, I was startled. It was without a doubt the one of which the first girls had reminded me. Here was the lady of the Sylvan incident sitting bodily before me, in her habit as she lived. Evidently enough, the two were sisters, with a nebulous kind of apprehension that I might be recognized as the mute and glorious hero of an adventure which had in my consciousness and conscious something of the character of an eavesdropping. I allowed myself but a hasty cup of the lukewarm coffee thoughtfully provided by the prescient waitress for the emergency, and left the table. As I passed out of the house into the grounds, I heard a rich, strong male voice singing an aria from Rigoletto. I am bound to say that it was exquisitely sung too, but there was something in the performance that displeased me. I could say neither what nor why, and I walked rapidly away. Returning later in the day, I saw the elder of the two young women standing on the porch, and near her was a tall man in black clothing, the man who I expected to see. All day, the desire to know something of these persons had been uppermost in my mind, and now resolved to learn what I could of them in any way that was neither dishonorable nor low. The man was talking easily and affably to his companion, but at the sound of footsteps on the gravel walk he ceased, and turning about looked at me full in the face. He was apparently of middle age, dark and uncommonly handsome. His attire was faultless, his bearing easy and graceful, the look of which he turned upon me open, free, and devoid of any suggestion of rudeness. Nevertheless, it affected me. I lost myself. Nevertheless, it affected me, with the distinct emotion which, on subsequent analysis in memory, appeared to be compounded of hatred and dread. I am unwilling to call it fear. A second later, the man and woman had disappeared. They seemed to have a trick of disappearing. On entering the house, however, I saw them through the open doorway of the parlor as I passed. They had merely stepped through a window which opened down to the floor. Cautiously approached on the subject of her new guests, my landlady proved not ungracious. Restated with, I hope, some small reverence for English grammar, the facts were these. The two girls were Pauline and Eva Maynard, of San Francisco. The elder was Pauline. The man was Richard Benning, their guardian, who had been an intimate friend of their father, now deceased. Mr. Benning had brought them to Brownville in the hope that the mountain climate would benefit Eva, who was thought to be in the danger of consumption. Upon these short and simple annals, the landlady wrought an embroidery of eulogium, which abundantly tested her faith in Mr. Benning's will and ability to pay for the best that her house afforded. That he had a good heart was evident to her from his devotion to these two beautiful words, and his really touching solicitude from their comfort. I wish I could read words properly. Solicitude for their comfort. The evidence impressed me as insufficient, and I silently found the Scotch verdict not proven. Certainly, Mr. Benning was most attentive to his words. In my strolls about the country, I frequently encountered them, sometimes in company with other guests of the hotel, exploring the gulches, fishing, rifle shooting, and otherwise whiling away the monotony of country life. And although I watched them as closely as good breeding would permit me, I saw nothing that would in any way explain these strange words I had overheard in the wood. I had grown tolerably well acquainted with the young ladies, and could exchange looks and even greetings with their guardian without actual repugnance. A month went by, and I had almost ceased to interest myself in their affairs, when one night our little community was thrown into excitement by an event which vividly recalled my experience in the forest. This was the death of the elder girl, Pauline. The sisters had occupied the same bedroom on the third floor of the house. Waking in the gray of the morning, Eva had found Pauline dead beside her in the bed. Later, when the poor girl was weeping beside the body amid a throng of sympathetic, if not very considerate persons, Mr. Benning entered the room and was, apparently, about to take her hand. She drew away from the side of the door and moved slowly toward... She moved away from the dead and moved slowly toward the door. "It is you," she said. "You who have done this. You! You!" "She is raving," he said in a low voice. He followed her step by step as he retreated. his eyes fixed upon hers with a steady gaze in which there was nothing of tenderness nor of compassion. She stopped. The hand that she had raised in accusation fell to her side. Her dilated eyes contracted visibly. The lids slowly dropped over them, veiling their strange wild beauty, and she stood motionless and almost as white as the dead girl lying near. The man took her hand and put his arm gently about her shoulders, as if to support her. Suddenly she burst into a passion of tears and clung to him as a child to its mother. He smiled with a smile that affected me most disagreeably. Perhaps any kind of smile would have done so, and led her to silently out of the room. There was an inquest, perhaps an autopsy, and the customary verdict: the deceased, it appeared, came to her death through heart disease. It was before the invention of heart failure, though the poor heart of poor Pauline had indubitably failed. The body was embalmed and taken to relatives in San Francisco by someone summoned thence for the purpose, neither Eva nor Benning accompanying it. Some of the hotels gossiped, ventured to think that the very strange and few hardy spirits went so far as to think it was very strange indeed, but the good landlady generously threw herself into the breach, saying it was owing to the precarious nature of the girl's health. It is not of record that either of the two persons most affected and apparently least concerned made any explanation. One evening, about a week after the death, I went out on the veranda of the hotel to get a book that I had left there. Under some vines shutting out the moonlight from a part of the space, I saw Richard Benning. For those whose give me a second. This is I'm doing the worst in this one by far. I'm mumbling through this by the worst. Let me try that sentence. Let me try that paragraph one more time. One evening, about a week after the death, I had went up on the veranda of the hotel to get a book that I had left there. Under some vines shutting out the moonlight from a part of the space, I saw Richard Benning, for whose apparition I was prepared by having previously heard the low, sweet voice of Eva Maynard, whom I now discerned standing before him with one hand raised to his shoulder and her eyes, as neatly as I could judge, gazing upwards into his. He held her disengaged hand, and his head was bent with a peculiar dignity and grace. Their attitude was that of lovers, and as I stood in the deep shadow to observe it, I felt even guiltier than on that memorable night in the wood. I felt even guiltier than on that memorable night in the wood. I was about to retire when the girl spoke, and the contrast between her words and her attitude was so surprising that I remained because I had merely forgotten to go away. "You will take my life," she said, "as you did Pauline's last week. I know your intention as well as I know your power, and I ask nothing, only that you finish your work without needless delay, and let me be at peace." He made no reply, merely letting go of the hand that he was holding, removing the other from his shoulder, and turning away, descended the steps leading into the garden, and disappeared in the shrubbery. But a moment later, I heard, seemingly from a great distance, his fine, clear voice in a barbaric chant, which, as I listened, brought before some inner spiritual sense of consciousness of some far, strange land, peopled with beings having forbidden powers. The song held me in a kind of spell, but when it had died away, I recovered and instantly perceived what I thought an opportunity. I walked out of my shadow to where the girl stood. She turned and looked at me with something of the look, it seemed to me, of a hunted hare. Possibly my intrusion had frightened her. "Miss Maynard," I said, "I beg you to tell me who that man is and the nature of his power over you. Perhaps this is impertinence in me, but it would not be a matter for idle civilities. When a woman is in danger, any man has a right to act." She listened without apparent emotion, almost, I thought, without interest, and when I had finished she closed her big blue eyes as if unspeakably weary. "You can do nothing," she said. I took hold of her arm, gently shaking her as one shakes a person falling into a dangerous sleep. "You must rouse yourself," I said. "Something must be done, and you must give me leave to act. You have said that that man killed your sister, and I believe it, that he will kill you, and I believe that." She merely raised her eyes to mine. "Will you not tell me all?" I added. "There is nothing to be done, I tell you. Nothing. And if I could do anything, I would not. It does not matter in the least. We shall be here only 2 days more. We go away then. Oh, so far. If you have observed anything, I beg you, be silent." "But this is madness, girl!" I was trying by rough speech to break the deadly repose of her manner. "You have accused him of murder. Unless you can explain these things to me, I shall lay the matter before the authorities." This roused her, but in a way I did not like. She lifted her head proudly and said, "Do not meddle, sir, in what does not concern you. This is my affair, Mr. Moron. Not yours. It concerns every person in the country, in the world, I answered with equal coldness. If you had no love for your sister, I at least am concerned for. Listen, she interrupted, leaning towards me. I loved her, yes, God knows. More than that, beyond expression, I love him. You have overheard a secret, but you shall not make use of it but you shall not make use of it to harm him. I shall deny it all. Your word against mine, it will be that. Do you think your authorities will believe you? She was now smiling like an angel, and God help me, I was heels over head in love with her. Did she, by some of the many methods of divination known to her sex, read my feelings? Her whole manner had altered. Come, she said almost coaxingly. Promise that you will not be impolite again. She took my arm in the most friendly way. Come, I will walk with you. He will not know. He will remain away all night. Up and down the veranda, we paced in the moonlight. She apparently forgetting her recent bereavement, cooing and murmuring girl lies of every kind of nothing in all of Brownville. I silent, consciously awkward, and with something of the feeling of being concerned in an intrigue. It was revelation. This most charming and apparently blameless creature coolly and confessedly deceiving the man for whom a moment before she had acknowledged and shown the supreme love, which finds even death an acceptable endearment. Truly, I thought, in my experience, here is something new under the moon. And the moon must have smiled. Before we parted, I had exacted a promise that she would walk with me the next afternoon, before going away forever, to the old mill, one of Brownville's revered antiquities, erected in 1860. If he is not about, she added gravely, as I let go the hand she had given me at parting, and of which, may the gods saints forgive me, I strove vainly to repossess myself when she had said it. So charming, as the wise Frenchman had pointed out, do we find woman's infidelity when we are its objects and not its victims. In apportioning his benefactions that night, the angel of sleep overlooked me. The Brownville house dined early, and after dinner on that next day, Miss Maynard, who had not been at the table, came to me on the veranda, attired in the demurest of walking costumes, saying not a word. He was evidently not about. We went slowly up the road that led to the old mill. She was apparently not strong, and at times took my arm, relinquishing it and taking it again rather capriciously, I thought. Her mood, or rather her succession of moods, was as mutable as skylight and rippling sea. She jested as if she had never heard of such a thing as death, and laughed on the lightest incitement, and directly afterwards would sing a few bars of some grave melody, with such tenderness of expression that I had to turn away my eyes, lest she should see the evidence of her success in art. If art was not artlessness, then I was compelled to think it. And she said the oddest things in the most unconventional way, skirting sometimes unfathomable abysses of thought, where I had hardly the courage to set foot. I can't read. Where I had hardly the courage to set foot. In short, she was fascinating in 1,050 different ways, and at every step I executed a new and profounder emotional folly, a hardier spiritual indiscretion, incurring a fresh liability to arrest by the invisible constabulary of conscience for infractions of my own peace. Arriving at the mill, she made no pretense of stopping, but turned into a trail leading through a field of stubble toward a creek. Crossing by a rustic bridge, we continued on the trail, which now led uphill to one of the most picturesque spots in the country. The Eagle's Nest, it was called, the summit of a cliff which rose sheer into the air at a height of hundreds of feet above the forest at its base. From this elevated point, we had a noble view of another valley, and of the opposite hills flushed with the last rays of the setting sun. As we watched the light escaping to higher and higher planes from the encroaching flood of shadow filling the valley, we heard footsteps, and in another moment we were joined by Richard Benning. I saw you from the road, he said carelessly, so I came up. Being a fool, I neglected to take him by the throat and pitch him into the treetops below, but muttered some polite lie instead. Upon the girl, the effect of his coming was immediate and unmistakable. Her face was suffused with the glory of love's transfiguration. The red light of the sunset had not been more obvious in her eyes than was now in the love light that replaced it. I'm so glad you came, she said, giving him both her hands, and God help me, it was manifestly true. Seating himself upon the ground, he began a lively dissertation upon the wildflowers of the region, a number of which he had with him, In the middle of a facetious sentence, he suddenly ceased speaking and fixed his eyes upon Eva, who leaned against the stump of a tree, absently plaiting grasses. She lifted her eyes in a startled way to his, as if she had felt his look. She then rose, cast away her grasses, and moved slowly away from him. He also rose and continued looking at her. He had still in his hand the bunch of flowers. The girl turned, as if to speak, but said nothing. I recall clearly now something of which I was but half conscious then, the dreadful contrast between the smile on her lips and the terrified expression in her eyes as she met his steady and imperative gaze. I know nothing of how it happened, nor how it was that I did not sooner understand it. I only know that with the smile of an angel upon her lips, that look of terror in her beautiful eyes, Eva Maynard sprang from the cliff and shot crashing into the tops of the pines below. How and how long afterward I reached the place I cannot say, but Richard Benning was already there, kneeling beside the dreadful thing that had once been a woman. She is dead. Quite dead, he said coldly. I will go to town for assistance. Please do me the favor to remain. He rose to his feet and moved away, but in a moment stopped and turned about. You have doubtless observed, my friend, he said, that this was entirely her own act. I did not rise in time to prevent it, and you, not knowing her mental condition, you could not, of course, have suspected. His manner maddened me. You are as much her assassin, I said, as if your damnable hands had cut her throat. He shrugged his shoulders without a reply, and turning, walked away. A moment later I heard through the deepening shadows of the wood into which he had disappeared a rich, strong baritone with voice singing La Donna è Mobile from Rigoletto. And that was An Occurrence at Brownville by Ambrose Bierce. What did you guys think of that one? That was, I think, my worst reading by far all night, so I apologize for that. But, that said, I love that story. I think it's very good. I like how it's not just, oh, this dude's in love with this girl, she needs saving, he saves her. Yeah, he's never had a chance of saving her, she doesn't want to be saved, she doesn't really even like the guy that much, she just wants to do something on her last day that's fun. And then she just fucking dies, and the guy gets away with it. I think that's a really interesting story, especially for that time period. Like, I'm trying to read more stories from around then. So maybe saying especially from that time period isn't correct, because I don't know much about stories from the time period. Maybe there's all the stories had cool little moments like that. I don't know. And seeing how I'm only an hour and 12 minutes in, and I am enjoying this, I will dare to read one more story, I think. And this one is another of Ambrose Bierce's stories from the collection Can Such Things Be? And it's called The Moonlit Road. Now, The Moonlit Road is an insanely influential story. I came to realize once I read it for the first time. It is what inspired Akira Kurosawa to create the movie Rashomon. And so any sort of movie or story or anything that came after Rashomon that was inspired by Rashomon was then inspired by The Moonlit Road. I think that's very cool. It's a short story in 3 parts. Each part is from the perspective of another character of similar but not the same events. So, that said, let's get into the last story of the evening. This is The Moonlit Road by Ambrose Bierce. Part 1. The Statement of Joel Hetman, Jr. I am the most unfortunate of men, rich, respected, fairly well educated, and of sound health, with many other advantages usually valued by those having them and coveted by those who have them not. I sometimes think that I should be less unhappy if they had been denied me, for then the contrast between my outer and inner life would not be as continually demanding of painful attention. In the stress of privation and the need of effort, I might sometimes forget the somber secret ever baffling the conjecture that it compels. I am the only child of Joel and Julia Hetman. The one was a well-to-do country gentleman, and the other a beautiful and accomplished woman to whom he was passionately attached with what I now know to have been a jealous and exacting devotion. The family home was a few miles from Nashville. From Nashville, Tennessee, a large, irregularly built dwelling of no particular order of architecture, a little way off the road, in a park of trees and shrubbery. At the time of which I write, I was 19 years old, a student at Yale. One day, I received a telegram from my father of such urgency that in compliance with its unexplained demand, I left at once for home. At the railway station in Nashville, a distant relative awaited me to appraise me. That's weirdly worded. It wasn't my fault. At the railway station in Nashville, a distant relative awaited me to appraise me of the situation and reason for my call. My mother had been barbarously murdered. Why and by whom, none could conjecture. But the circumstances were these. My father had gone to Nashville, intending to return the next afternoon. Something prevented his accomplishing the business in hand, so he returned on the same night, arriving just before dawn. In his testimony before the coroner, he explained that having no latchkey and not caring to disturb the sleeping servants, he had, with no clearly defined intention, gone round to the rear of the house, and he turned an angle of the building. He heard a sound as a door gently closed, and saw in the darkness indistinctly the figure of a man, which instantly disappeared among the trees of the lawn. A hasty pursuit and brief search of the grounds in the belief that the trespasser was one secretly visiting a servant proving fruitless. He entered at the unlocked door and mounted the stairs to my mother's chamber. Its door was open, and stepping into black darkness he fell headlong over some heavy object on the floor. I may spare myself the details, but it was my poor mother, dead of strangulation by human hands. Nothing had been taken from the house. The servants had heard no sound, and excepting those terrible finger marks upon the dead woman's throat, dear God, that I might forget them, no trace of assassins was ever found. I gave up my studies and remained with my father, who, naturally, was greatly changed. Always of a sedate, taciturn disposition, he now fell into a deep dejection that nothing could hold his attention. Yet anything, a footfall, the sudden closing of a door aroused him in a fitful interest. One might have called it an apprehension. At any small surprise of the senses he would start visibly and sometimes turn pale, then relapse into a melancholy apathy deeper than before. I suppose he was what is called a nervous wreck. As to me, I was younger than now. There is much in that. Youth is gilead, in which I balm for every wound. I have no idea what that means. Youth is Gilead. Youth is Gilead. That I might again dwell in that enchanted land. Unacquainted with grief, I knew not how to appraise my bereavement. I could not rightly estimate the strength of the stroke. One night, a few months after the dreadful event, my father and I walked home from the city. The full moon was about 3 hours above the eastern horizon. The entire countryside had the solemn stillness of a summer night. Our footfalls and the ceaseless songs of the katydids was the only sound aloft. Black shadows of bordering trees lay athwart the road. In the short reaches between gleamed a ghostly white. As we approached the gate to our dwelling, whose front was in shadow, and in which no light shone, my father suddenly stopped and clutched his arm heartily above his breath. God, what is that? I hear nothing, I replied. But see, he said, pointing along the road directly ahead. I said, nothing is there. Come, father, let us get you in. You are ill. He released my arm and was standing rigid and motionless in the center of the illuminated roadway, staring like one bereft of sense. His face in the moonlight showed a pallor of fixity inexpressibly distressing. I pulled gently at his sleeve, but he had forgotten my existence. Presently he began to retire backward, step by step, never for an instant removing his eyes from what he saw, or thought he saw. I turned half round to follow, but stood irresolute. I do not recall any feeling or fear, unless a sudden chill was its physical manifestation. It seemed as if an icy wind had touched my face and enfolded my body from head to foot. I could feel the stir of it in my hair. At that moment, my attention was drawn to a light that suddenly streamed from an upper window to the house. One of the servants, awakened by what mysterious premonition of evil who could say? Let me read that again. At that moment, my attention was drawn to a light that suddenly streamed from an upper window of the house. One of the servants, awakened by what mysterious premonition of evil who can say, and in obedience to an impulse that she was never able to name, had lit a lamp. When I turned to look for my father, he was gone. And in all the years that have passed, no whisper of his fate has come across the borderland of conjecture from the realm of the unknown. That was part one. Part 2. Statement of Caspar Great Grattan. Grattan. Grayton Grattan. Don't really know what the correct pronunciation of that is. I'm gonna guess Grattan. That's what I'll go with. Today I am said to live. Tomorrow, here in this room, I will lie a senseless shape of clay. That all too long was I. If anyone lift the cloth from the face of that unpleasant thing, it will be a gratification of a mere morbid curiosity. Some doubtless will go further and inquire, who was he? In this writhing I supply the only answer that I am able to make, Caspar Grattan. Surely that should be enough. The name has served my small need for more than 20 years of a life of unknown length. True, I gave it to myself, but lacking another I had the right. In this world one must have a name. It prevents confusion, even when it does not establish identity. Some, though, are known by numbers, which also seem inadequate distinctions. One day, for illustration, I was passing along a street of a city, far from here, when I met two men in uniform, one of whom, half pausing and looking curiously into my face, said to his companion, "That man looks like 767. Something in the number seemed familiar and horrible. Moved by an uncomfortable impulse, I sprang into a side street and ran until I fell exhausted in a country lane. I have never forgotten that number, and always it comes to my memory, attended by gibbering obscenity, pearls of joyless laughter, the clang of iron doors. So I say a name, even if self-bestowed, is better than a number. In the register of the potter's field, I shall soon have both. What wealth! Of him who shall find this paper, I must beg a little consideration. It is not the history of my life. The knowledge to write that is denied me. This is only a record of broken. This is only a record of brokered. This is only a record of broken and apparently unrelated memories. Some of them as distinct and sequent as brilliant beads upon a thread. Others remote and strange, having the character of crimson dreams within interspaces, blank and black witch fires, glowing still and red in a great desolation. Standing upon the shore of eternity, I turn for a last look landwards over the course of which I came. There are 20 years of footprints fairly distinct, the impressions of bleeding feet. They lead through poverty and pain, devious and unsure, as of one staggering beneath a burden, remote, unfriended, melancholy, slow. Ah, the poet's prophecy of me how admirable. How dreadfully admirable. Backwards beyond beginning of this Visa Dolorosa, this epic of suffering, with episodes of sin, I see nothing clearly. It's something out of a cloud. I know that it spans only 20 years, yet I am an old man. One does not remember one's birth, one has to be told. But with me it was different. Life came to me full-handed and dowered me with all my faculties and powers. Of a previous existence I know no more than others, for all have stammering intimations that may have been memories and may be dreams. I know only that my first consciousness was of a maturity in a body and mind, a consciousness accepted without surprise or conjecture. I merely found myself walking in a forest, half-clad, footsore, unutterably weary and hungry. Seeing a farmhouse, I approached and asked for food, which was given to me by one who inquired my name. I did not know, yet knew that all had names. Greatly embarrassed, I retreated, and night coming in, lay down in the forest and slept. The next day, I entered a large town, which I shall not name, nor shall I recount further incidents of the life that is now to end, a life of wandering. Always and everywhere haunted by an overmastering sense of crime and punishment, of wrong and of terror and punishment of crime. Let me see if I can reduce it to narrative. I seem once to have lived near a great city, a prosperous planter, married to a woman who I loved and distrusted. We had, it sometimes seems, one child, a youth of brilliant parts and promise. He is at all times a vague figure, never clearly drawn, frequently altogether out of the picture. One luckless evening it occurred to me to test my wife's fidelity in a vulgar, commonplace way familiar to everyone who has acquaintance, that with the literature of fact and fiction. I went to the city, telling my wife that I would be absent until the following afternoon. but I returned before daybreak and went to the rear of the house, purposing to enter by a door which I had secretly so tampered that it would seem to lock, yet not actually fasten. As I approached it, I heard it gently open and close, and saw a man steal away into the darkness. With murder in my heart, I sprang after him, but he had vanished without even the bad luck of identification. Sometimes now I cannot even persuade myself that it was a human being. Crazed with jealousy and rage, blind and bestial with all the elemental passions of insulted manhood, I entered the house and sprang up on the stairs to the door of my wife's chamber. It was closed, but having tampered with its lock also, I easily entered, and despite the black darkness, Stoon stood beside of her bed. My groping hands told me that although disarranged, it was unoccupied. She is below, I thought, and terrified about my entrance, has evaded me in the darkness of the hall. With the purpose of seeking her, I turned to leave the room, but took a wrong direction, the right one. My foot struck her. Cowering in a dark room, instantly my hands were at her throat. Stifling a shriek, my ears were upon her struggling body, and there was in the darkness, without a word of accusation or reproach, I strangled her till she died. There ends the dream. I have related it in the past tense, but the present would be a fitter form, for again and again the somber tragedy reenacts itself in my consciousness. Over and over I lay the plan, I suffer the confirmation, I redress the wrong. Then all is blank, and afterward the rains beat against the grimy window panes, or the snow falls upon my scant attire. The wheels rattle in the squalid streets, where my life lies in poverty and means of employment. If there was ever sunshine, I do not recall it. If there are birds, they do not sing. There is another dream, another vision of the night. I stand among the shadows in a moonlit road. I am aware of another presence, but whose I cannot rightly determine. In the shadow of a great dwelling, I catch the gleam of white garments. Then the figure of a woman confronts me in the road. My murdered oh my god, this is the climax. I'm fucking it up. There is another dream, another vision of the night. I stand among the shadows in a moonlit road. I am aware of another presence, but whose I cannot rightly determine. In the shadow of a great dwelling, I catch the gleam of white garments. Then the figure of a woman confronts me in the road. My murdered wife. There is death in the face. There are marks upon the throat. The eyes are fixed on mine with an infinite gravity which is not reproach, nor hate, nor menace, nor anything less than terrible recognition. Before this awful apparition, I retreat in terror, a terror that is upon me as I write. I can no longer rightly shape the words. See, they... Now I am calm. But truly, there is no more to tell. The incident ends where it began, in darkness and in doubt. Yes, I am again in control of myself, the captain of my soul. But that is not respite. It is another stage and phase of expiation. My penance, constant in degree, is mutable in kind. One of its variants is tranquility. After all, it is only a life sentence. To hell for life. That is a foolish penalty. The culprit chooses the duration of his punishment. Today, my term expires. To each and all, the peace that was not mine. That was part 2. And now for the third and final part. Part 3. Statement of the late Julia Hetman through the medium Bay Rolls. I had retired early and fallen almost immediately into a peaceful sleep, from which I had awoke from that indefinable sense of peril which is, I think, a common experience in that other earlier life. Of its unmeaning character too, I was entirely persuaded, yet that did not banish it. My husband, Joel Hetman, was away from home. The servants slept in another part of the house, but these were familiar conditions. They had never before distressed me. Nevertheless, strange terror grew so insupportable that, conquering my reluctance, I sat up and lit the lamp at my bedside. Contrary to my expectation, this gave me no relief. The light seemed rather an added danger, for I reflected that it would shine out under the door, disclosing my presence to whatever evil might lurk outside. You, that are still in the flesh, subject to horrors of the imagination, think what a monstrous fear that might be which seeks in darkness security from malevolent existences of the night. That is to spring to close quarters with an unseen enemy, the strategy of despair. Extinguishing the lamp, I pulled the bed clothing about my head, and lay trembling and silent, unable to shriek, forgetful to pray. In this pitiable state I must have lain for what you call hours. With us there are no hours. There is no time. At last came a soft, irregular sound of footfalls. On the stairs! They were slow, hesitant, uncertain, as something that did not see its way. To my disordered reason, all the more terrifying for that as the approach of some blind and mindless malevolence to which there is no appeal. I even thought that I must have left the hall lamp burning, and the groping of this creature proved it a monster of the night. This was foolish and inconsistent with my previous dread of the light, but what would you have? Fear has no brains. It is an idiot. The dismal witness that it bears and the cowardly counsel that it whispers are unrelated. We know this well, and we who have passed into the realm of terror, who skulk in eternal dusk among the senses of our former lives, invisible even to ourselves and one another, yet hiding forlorn in lonely places, yearning for speech with our loved ones, yet dumb and as fearful of them as they of us. Sometimes the disability is removed, the law suspended. By the deathless power of love or hate, we break the spell, and we are seen by those whom we would warn, console, or punish. What form we seem to bear, we know not. We know only that we terrify even those whom we wish to comfort, and from whom we most crave tenderness and sympathy. Forgive, I pray you, the inconsequent digression, but was once a woman. You who consult us in this imperfect way, you do not understand. You ask foolish questions about things unknown and things forbidden. Much that we know and can impart in our speech is meaningless in yours. We must communicate with you through a stammering intelligence in that small fraction of our language that you yourselves can speak. You think that we are all of another world. No, we have knowledge of no world but yours, though for us it holds no sunlight, no warmth, no music, no laughter, no songs of birds, nor any companionship. O God, what a thing it is to be a ghost, cowering and shivering in an altered world, a prey to apprehension and despair. No, I did not die of fright. The thing turned and went away. I heard it go down the stairs hurriedly, I thought, as if itself in sudden fear. Then I rose to call for help. Hardly had my shaking hand found the doorknob when, merciful heaven, I heard it returning. Its footfalls as it remounted the stairs were rapid, heavy, and loud. They shook the house. I fled to an angle of the wall and crouched upon the floor. I tried to throw open. Ooh. Let me try that again. I tried to pray. I tried to call the name of my dear husband. Then I heard the door thrown open. There was an eternal unconscious. Let me actually hold on 1 second. There was an interval of unconsciousness, and when I revived, I was strangling, clutched. Every time I get to the climax. Then I heard the door thrown open. There was an interval of unconsciousness, and when I revived, I felt a strangling clutch upon my throat. Felt my arms feebly beating against something that bore me backwards. Felt my tongue thrusting itself from between my teeth. And then I passed into this life. No, I have no idea. No, I have no knowledge of who it was. The sum of what we knew at death is the measure of what we know afterwards, of all that went before. Of this existence we know many things, but no new light falls upon any page of that, and memory is written all of it that we can read. Here are no heights of truth overlooked the confused landscape of that dubitable domain. We still dwell in the valley of the shadow, lurk in its desolate places, peering from brambles and thickets at its mad, malign inhabitants. How should we have new knowledge of that fading past? What I am about to relate happened on a night. We know when it is night, for then you retire to your houses, and we can venture from our places of concealment to move unafraid about our old homes, to look in at the windows, even to enter and gaze upon your faces as you sleep. I had lingered long near the dwellings where I had been so cruelly changed to what I am, as we do while any that we love or hate remain. Vainly I sought some method of manifestation, some way to make my continued existence and my great love and poignant pity understood by my husband and son. Always, if they slept, they would wake, or if in my desperation I dared approach them when they were awake, would turn toward me the terrible eyes of the living, frightened by the glances that I sought from the purposes that I held. On this night I had searched for them, without success. Fearing to find them, they were nowhere in the house, nor about the moonlit dawn. For although the sun is lost to us forever, the moon, full orbed or slender, remains to us. Sometimes it shines by night, sometimes by day, but always it rises and sets, as in that other life. I left the lawn and moved in the white light and silence along the roads, aimless and sorrowing. Suddenly I heard the voice of my poor husband in exclamations and astonishment, with that of my son in reassurance and dissuasion. And there by the shadow of a group of trees they stood, near, so near. Their faces toward me, the eyes of the elder man fixed upon mine. He saw me at last. At last he saw me. In the consciousness of that, my terror fled as a cruel dream. The death spell was broken. Love had conquered law. Mad with exultation, I must have shouted, "He sees! He sees! He will understand!" Then, controlling myself, I moved forward, smiling and consciously beautiful, to offer myself into his arms, to comfort him with endearments, and, with my son's hand in mine, to speak words that should restore the broken bond between the living and the dead. Alas! Alas! His face went white with fear. His eyes were as those of a hunted animal. He backed away from me as I advanced, and at last turned and fled into the wood whither. It is not given to me to know. Let me reread that correctly. He backed away from me as I advanced, and at last turned and fled into the wood, whither it is not given to me to know. To my poor boy, I left doubly desolate. I have never been able to impart a sense of my presence. Soon he too must pass to this life invisible and be lost to me forever. And that was The Moonlit Road by Ambrose Bierce. That one's a bit of a bummer, right? I think that is a fantastic ghost story. I think it tells it gives you a sense of what ghosts are in a more interesting way, in a more dreadful way. The fact that at the end she mentions that even if he dies, her son dies, they won't be able to find each other. Like that sucks. Like it's, to me, it shows that dying is like the worst thing that can happen to someone. It's insane. I also love the hint that there was something in the house before the husband came back and killed her, and no one knows what it was. She has no reason to lie, so I don't think she knew what it, like I don't believe she knew what it was. What was it? Was it just a burglar that came to the house and skulked away when maybe it sensed the husband heading home? I don't know. But I think it's a very cool story. And I hope you guys liked it. Speaking of liked it, I hope you guys liked the stream. I enjoyed it very much. I had a good time. I might do this again. I'm not going to make this a weekly thing like I do some of the other stuff I like to do, but I'm definitely going to do this again at some point. And I hope you guys join me for that as well. I'm not sure if I'm going to stream again before Thursday, but I do plan on streaming on Thursday. That is my... Oh. Thank you very much to Jake Twitchin. I appreciate that very much. I hope that means you like the stream, because that means a lot. I really enjoy doing it, and I hope that you enjoyed the stories. I guess any suggestions for future stories would be cool. I have some ideas already for ones I want to read, but yeah, this was refreshing, dude. Better than the mostly filth I typically watch on Twitch. Good to hear. Don't tell Leo that, though, because he's the filthiest of all. Now, thank you guys so much. Like I said, I doubt I'll stream Tuesday or Wednesday to this week. I think my next stream will be me trying out my... we'll be redoing my last stream that got fucked up. I'll be doing my radio stream again. And I hope, I pray that it'll go better than the last time. And yeah. See you Thursday. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good night. Bye-bye.